Welcome to Global India. I'm Tanvi Madan, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution specializing in Indian foreign policy. On this new Brookings podcast, we'll be turning the spotlight on India's partnerships, its rivalries, and its role on the global stage. There's an iconic set of photographs from 2009. They were taken in Copenhagen at COP15, the United Nations Climate Change Summit. They depict a conference table. On one side sits US President Barack Obama. On the opposite side, not just of the table, but vis-a-vis the issues being discussed, sat Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao. It was a different era, one in which India and China often cooperated on the multilateral stage, on climate change, on trade, on global economic governance, even on cyber governance. The two countries were also part of small coalitions or minilaterals, or plurilaterals as India calls them. Earlier, that same year in 2009, in fact, the Chinese and Indian leaders had joined their Russian and Brazilian counterparts for the first summit of the BRIC countries, which eventually became BRICS when South Africa joined them as well. They had a Russia-India-China trilateral, and India eventually became a member of the China and Russia-driven Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Today, India continues to be a member of BRICS and SCO, but it's now more often sitting on the opposite side of the table from China when it comes to the multilateral and minilateral domains. From an arena of Sino-Indian cooperation, these domains too have become an arena of competition. The two Asian giants continue to be like-minded on some multilateral issues, but more often than not, their interactions are now competitive, if not adversarial, whether it's at the UN Security Council, in other global or regional organizations, or vis-a-vis the developing world or what we call today the Global South. China even criticizes India's membership of minilaterals such as the Quad. Their bilateral tensions have spilled over into groupings such as the BRICS, where, for instance, Indian officials try to ensure that their Chinese counterparts don't succeed in getting language about Chinese initiatives such as the Global Development Initiative into joint statements. To discuss India-China interactions in the multilateral and minilateral domains, I'm joined today by Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin and Ms. Indrani Bagchi. Ambassador Akbaruddin, or Akbar, is Dean of the Kautilya School of Public Policy in Hyderabad. He previously served for a number of years as an Indian official, including as India's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. He also served at the IAEA, or the International Atomic Energy Agency, on deputation. Indrani Bagchi is Chief Executive Officer of the Ananta Center in New Delhi. Prior to that, she covered foreign policy issues, including as Associate Editor and Diplomatic Editor for the Times of India, one of India's largest selling English daily newspapers, for nearly 2 decades. Before I continue on to the interview with Akbar and Indrani, I want to thank you all for listening to or watching the podcast, providing feedback, and sending me questions on social media. I want to highlight that we'll be ending the season of the podcast early next year with a special Q&A episode in which I will answer audience questions about India-China relations. So please do send us any questions you'd like answered or that you wished had been answered during the course of the season. You can do so by posting your question on Twitter or X with the hashtag GlobalIndia, all one word. Or if you'd prefer to submit your questions through email, you can send it to globalindia@brookings.edu. That's globalindia@brookings.edu. Now let's continue on to the conversation. Welcome to the Global India podcast, Akbar.
Thank you very much, Tanvi, for having me on your show.
Indrani, welcome to you as well.
Thanks, Tanvi. Great to be on your show.
As we think about kind of the UN system, Akbar, I feel there's nobody better to speak about this subject than you. You've been India's permanent representative at the UN in New York. You have also done stints in the 90s at that mission, but also been on deputation at the International Atomic Energy Agency. If we're talking about and thinking about China's approach in the UN system, from India's perspective, how have you thought about it?
So Tanvi, if you are my age group, you've seen this evolve over 30, 40 years. And you're right, my first introduction to China and at the UN was in the early 90s. At that stage, like India, China played what I would say is a defensive game. It's a game that it thought it's a Western, primarily Western institution. It would intervene when it thought that its core interests were being impeded or impacted. Otherwise, it would stay back. But it never hesitated when its core interests were being impeded. For example, in the 1970s, China vetoed Bangladesh's entry into the UN as a member. In fact, that was within months of joining the UN. But otherwise, it would be much more restrained, would not participate very much, would allow others to do the dirty work, and would wait until it felt it was essential to participate or put in its viewpoint. That said, as China's economy grew, as China became more assertive on the global stage in its bilateral relations, obviously it started getting reflected in the multilateral system too. So, if I would want to put it, I suppose somewhere around 2007, 2010 was the time when China graduated to a much more assertive role in the international system, in the multilateral system. And you can also look at it in another way if you look at China's financial contributions. So, China used to contribute, when I was first there, less than 2% of the UN budget. Today, it contributes 15% of the UN budget in terms of the general budget and 18% for the peace and security. So you can see the exponential change in China's role at the UN purely in financial terms. And once you become a stakeholder with that magnitude of financial contributions, you start taking much more assertive positions. China now says, interestingly, that it's the first country which signed the UN Charter, and it's not wrong. China was the first country which signed the UN Charter, so it projects itself as a UN insider all the way through. Not some country which had come in between and then took time to adjust, etc. It now has reinvented itself as a major stakeholder. It insists that its representation of in terms of staff is much lower than what it should be, because at 18% it's very much low compared to what it is. Look at India on the other side. We've grown a little relative. We also get some benefits because we are not a permanent member, so they don't put a surcharge on us in the Security Council. So our contribution today is about 1%, a little above 1%. Hasn't changed very much. When I was in the 90s, it used to be about 0.6, 0.7. So it's about 1.01 or 1.02, etc. So you can clearly see that it's now become an assertive power and much more a stakeholder which puts in more into the multilateral system and desires to get more. And that's the fundamental change that you can see over the last, say, 25, 30 years.
What we've also seen is China seek leadership of various international organizations. We've just had a report, in fact, from the US Congress-mandated China Commission with a whole list of these organizations which China is leading. Indrani, how does India view this Chinese quest for leadership of these organizations, for these key positions? But also, what has China's approach to Indian membership of various and leadership of various organizations been?
Well, we've seen certainly over the last decade, China has moved quite decisively to take leadership of what seemed to be innocuous organizations initially, but then they became quite consequential. And if you look at the map, China actually heads some of the biggest organizations within the UN, and that is not by accident, that is completely by design. How does China view India's participation in these organizations? When it's an election, uh, often India wins elections, and India does really well with elections. But China brings a greater heft uh, to its position. So yes, India, but also India started late, much later than China, when it came to lobbying to be heads of organizations. I mean, Akbar has, in his days when he was PR in New York, he worked to get many Indians in different, ITLOS, for instance, in different UN organizations. But again, we started very late. I suppose, if you look at India and China, the asymmetry really shows very starkly when you look at your sort of participation in the United Nations. The other point is, of course, that because India is hamstrung because it's not a member of the Security Council, not a permanent member, and that brings, I mean, whatever aspirations in India might have, there's always a drawback. That's always something that draws us back. Uh, I think China would, in a straight election, India might be able to get, India has been able to get many more votes when it has been elected, often even unanimous Indian elections. Uh, but then China can really bring muscle, money, etc., to its own elections in bodies that actually take the big decisions. And that's, I think, that's where we are.
And particularly, I think China is focused on standard setting organizations
Yeah.
as well.
Hmm.
Akbar, one thing Indrani mentioned was India not being a member of the UN Security Council. Now, who knows if and when reform happens and how that progresses. But nonetheless, you've had four out of the P5 take a different view than China of India's membership of the Security Council. China has not endorsed Indian membership. How has that been? Has that always been its position? What lies behind it from your perspective?
So it's true that China has never been articulate on Security Council reform. It talks in generalities. It hasn't moved from square A. It says that it supports a greater role for developing countries in the UN system or in the Security Council. And now, this is a position that is held for, I think, maybe 25 years or 30 years. But what it has done is, initially, the objections to India's permanent membership were from a rung of middle class. So, Italy, Argentina, Pakistan, perhaps Indonesia a little bit, but not very vociferously. These were the countries who were objecting to reform. When I was there last, that scenario had changed. It's now China that blocks every effort for reform. The others are at the periphery. China puts in a lot of resources. It takes Security Council reform very seriously. It lobbies with an array of states where it has now developed very strong links and forces them to come out and say this is not the time, etc. and all. So China clearly has moved in terms of Security Council reform. It's moved to a very assertive and aggressive position where it says strategic patience is required. This is not the time because developing countries won't gain very much from it. Africa will be left behind, so don't agree to it now. We need to wait for an appropriate moment, etc., etc. So it clearly has become much more assertive in opposing any format of Security Council reform.
Indrani, one place where at least the public saw a very public or a very open, almost kind of process driven, or the public saw this process play out of China blocking or having very strong views about Indian membership, but also a waiver for India, was the Nuclear Suppliers Group. You covered this extensively. For our audience who's not familiar, what was in when India was trying to get a waiver at the nuclear suppliers group? Can you explain why it was trying to do this, and what China's approach was to that, and what China's approach to India's membership of the nuclear suppliers group has been as well?
Among the four non-proliferation regimes, which is the Nuclear Suppliers Group, Wassenaar Arrangement, the Australia Group, and the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime. Um, one of the promises made to India by the US when India and the US negotiated and signed the India-US nuclear deal was that the US would facilitate um, India's a waiver, a single waiver for India to conduct nuclear commerce. That occupied a mammoth piece of diplomacy between 2005 and 2008, as the US and India worked really hard to convince other countries, other members of the UN, of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, to grant India that waiver. Uh, it in 2008, when the Nuclear Suppliers Group was debating this, it was China who walked out of the Nuclear Suppliers Group meeting at midnight. As you said, I covered it extensively, uh, including sitting in front of the Nuclear Suppliers Group building, which is actually the Japanese mission in Vienna, and we sat on the pavement because they wouldn't let us inside. And but the Chinese actually left the building, and it took a phone call from uh, Condi Rice to Hu Jintao in the middle of the night, China time, to get a yes from him. Now, this was China in 2008. For 2 years prior, China had used a galaxy of countries, including a bunch of European countries like Ireland, Austria, Netherlands, you name it, Norway, to block the Indian requisition for a waiver. But anyway, China, as it turned out, realpolitik won in the end. That was an exercise of American power. China relented and India got that waiver. But I think China realized that this would rebound on China in a very different way. So when the time came for India to when India applied for actual membership, remember that what we got in 2008 was just a waiver. But when we applied for actual membership, China very openly blocked us. And today, the state is that India is a member of all the other three non-proliferation regimes, but it is not a member of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And China has used a whole number of uh, sort of excuses, including getting Pakistan in as a member uh, of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. So I have grave doubts that we will ever become either a member of the Nuclear Suppliers Group or, frankly, a member of the UN Security Council a permanent member of the UN Security Council.
And of course, today, the US China relationship not in the state it was, or the kind of persuasion or otherwise
Yeah,
that the US could extend to get China to yes on either of those.
but the other thing, Tanvi, is while China is, and what Akbar said, which China's right now very openly opposing India's permanent membership to the UN Security Council. But it doesn't seem like the other four are really doing any heavy lifting, frankly. They're like, okay, we want you there, but China doesn't want you there. And really, does anybody want to open that club up? I am not so sure.
Akbar, what have the other concerns for India been in terms of China's activities at the UN system? I know both of you have mentioned Pakistan in different ways, and has that the China-Pakistan partnership played out at the UN in ways, or have there been other concerns that India has had about Chinese activities at the UN?
Yeah. So before I go to that, I'd just like to quickly jump in on what you said about others not willing to do the heavy lifting. So let me tell you, I haven't heard any US diplomat ever in my 30 years plus at the UN ever speak once in favor of India as a permanent member. President Biden says, President Obama says, President Bush says, President Trump says, and it figures regularly in bilateral outside the UN context. But never once have I heard even a third secretary from the US mission say, well, the US, or just read out from the statement saying that President Biden and President Prime Minister Modi met and US support. So there is blame to be apportioned everywhere in that issue. Now, coming back to what other things, of course, this is primarily a major issue, but there are other things. For example, counterterrorism. Now, for much of India, counterterrorism is focused on Pakistan engagements with terrorists, cross-border terrorism. And there is a nexus between China and Pakistan, whereby China does not allow any Indian effort to go through. Now, we have succeeded a couple of times, but that's because the price we have to pay and the heavy lifting we have to do, like in the NSG waiver, it's a huge cost to get. So Masood Azhar, we tried 4 times and finally made it over a period of 15 years with the help of others, but it was primarily China. So they come with very many interesting conceptions saying that why don't Pakistan and you first agree? Now, if we had wanted to agree and work it out, why would we come to the UN? I mean, we could do it bilaterally. What's this argument that it is? And I have been once or twice an observer where the present foreign minister Wang Yi said, who is Masood Azhar? I haven't even heard of him. Why is he coming into this conversation? So it's pretty clear China is hand in glove with Pakistan, and for reasons that it may want to protect its ally and a strategic ally at that. So that nexus has only deepened. For many years, we could see that evolving in different areas, but we've now started seeing it after post 2019, even on issues of Kashmir. Now, for the first time after 50 years, China tried to bring up a discussion on Kashmir in the informal consultations. That it failed is a separate issue, but it's the first time since 1971 that China tried. Previously, there were other states, smaller states, who want to do good, try to help India and Pakistan, etc. Say, well, why don't you work out and all? But this was the first time China tried, and it masqueraded as a champion of human rights, saying human rights in Kashmir are being violated, etc. Again, it's the first time I ever heard China talk as a champion of human rights, because always on the defensive in these things. So you can see how strong the bond is, that it is willing to go into areas where it is not on a comfortable wicket. Yet it did so, it tried and it failed. But it shows that counterterrorism, again, like Security Council reform, is an area where China would not be comfortable in India moving ahead.
Good.
Indrani, do you want to add anything to that or other concerns, whether at the UN in New York or in other multilateral organizations? Have there been concerns that India has had?
From China? Yes. I mean, I mean, I would say, frankly, something that the world let the ball slip, literally, dropped the ball on, was UNCLOS. in 2016 when
The UN Law of the Sea for.
the UN Law of the Sea, exactly, and when the Permanent Court of Arbitration awarded Philippines a victory in that case against China's uh, building artificial islands on the South China Sea, awarded the entire South China Sea to Philippines. Nobody Nobody endorsed that. I mean, you did not, we did not even, we pretended, not India certainly, but pretended that the world, that it did not happen. I mean, China certainly pretended that the world, that award did not happen. And nobody held China to account on the rules based order, the international laws that everybody is supposed to. Of course, I mean, the US is on a weak wicket there because the US itself is not a signatory to the to UNCLOS. And but to protest today that China's militarized the South China Sea, when there was a decision, a verdict, nobody stood by Philippines then. And and nobody, I mean, we always talk about the Chinese sort of not obeying the rules-based order, and we get the rules-based order thrown at India. But if you remember, in 2014, India actually accepted a verdict by the same Permanent Court of Arbitration to demarcate a maritime boundary with Bangladesh, and awarded, if I'm not mistaken, something to the tune of 20,000 square kilometers of the Bay of Bengal to Bangladesh. India did not contest the ruling. It helped to demarcate the exclusive zone for Bangladesh and, frankly, the maritime boundary. Uh, but do you hear anybody saying that India is a big sort of upholder of the UN, of the international rules-based order? You know, we don't get any of that. Instead, we are always held up for challenging the international rules-based order, but that's not true. The rules-based order is challenged by the very sort of titans who are supposed to uphold the rules-based order. So it's not just in the UN system. And, Akbar talked about the counterterrorist committee. I mean, which is the 1267 committee. I think it is like pulling teeth to get for Indian diplomats to get terrorists named, and I think we are on the fourth or the fifth block of, I think, one of Masood Azhar's brothers, even today.
I will say, I think, on the arbitral award, you did have some countries actually stand up for Philippines. I think the challenge, though, is one that I think the UN system faces across the board, which is once a fait accompli has been presented, you can stand by Philippines, but reversing those decisions or getting enforcement is a crucial problem. I mean, one thing you have seen is occasionally, in fact, American Navy leadership often actually points to the arbitral, India's acceptance of the arbitral award. But again, you can point to, as an example, but that enforcement is, how do you reverse these decisions? Hence, I think the importance of actually trying to prevent these things in the first place. Akbar, we've seen, we've talked about some of these concerns, but we have seen China and India cooperate at the UN. I remember it must have been 4 or 5 years ago where you called, in answer to a question, you called China and India frenemies, where you said, we do compete, but we do work together. What are some of those areas where India and China have worked together on multilateral issues or at the UN?
Like I mentioned, our initial engagement with China at the UN was largely a cooperative one. If you look at development issues, where India and China, which considers itself to be the largest developing country, etc., cooperated on a whole host of things. However, the second one was sustainable development goals. Again, these were areas where when the SDGs were being negotiated, the idea was that they should be bottom up rather than the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which were the choice of the Secretary General, and he would have been influenced by others, etc. So, on a host of economic issues, there was cooperation. A second area where there has been cooperation is climate change,
Climate.
and that has been again on phasing out or phasing down this big controversy where China and India cooperated. The the issue is that these areas have become smaller compared to the areas of uh, differences. Uh, and as you said, it's very easy to work out and stop at the beginning rather than change. So, increasingly over the last, say, after 2015, as India China relations also started deteriorating bilaterally, you could see at the UN too that there were this array of differences which came out. In fact, um, if you go back in UN and look at it, 2014, we proposed the International Yoga Day. China, at that very General Assembly, Xi Jinping talked of one belt, one road. Nobody noticed it because the way he said it, it was not something that was attractive. And then China, while we got a resolution, China started populating Xi Jinping thought into a whole array of UN resolutions. And when we started pointing out, for us, it was easy to look at one belt, one road because we had very serious objections to it of a sovereign nature. But the US, it allowed it through even in Security Council resolutions on Afghanistan, etc. And when we pointed out to them, they did realize, and it was quite a difficult task to claw back. In fact, if you now see any of the resolutions, they have been cleansed because they are usually the next iteration comes the next year, etc. Those have been cleansed, but it took 2 or 3 years even for the US to understand what was happening, because China would say community of shared destiny. It would say win-win situation, and everybody would say, "What's wrong with win-win? This is a good term, etc." Little realizing that this was integral to Xi Jinping thought. So the areas of cooperation, since I said that in 2017 or so, have shrunken, and the areas of divergence has grown. So I'll just give you one more example. So the Quad, till 2020, we never had a meeting of Quad countries at any international platform. I remember Ambassador Nikki Haley, who is now making headlines and waves in the US presidential election, repeatedly asking me when she was the PR, let's have an informal meeting of the Quad. And repeatedly I was told, no informal meeting, no nothing. This is as late as 2018 or something like that. And then that was our considered position, that this is a headquarters driven agenda, shouldn't be proliferated into the UN domain, etc., which was fine if we followed the same path for BRICS, if we followed the same option for SCO. But we were meeting as BRICS ambassadors. SCO has a resolution in the UN about cooperation, and we were members of the SCO, so we would be coaxed to support some of those things that we were not happy with. But we had, in an SCO context of give and take, maybe we had agreed to it at a certain stage. So I think over the years, we've definitely moved on. And now, if I was asked that question, I don't know what my answer would be now for that.
It's interesting now. I think not just at the UN, but around the world, Quad ambassadors meet regularly. I used to keep a list thinking, oh, the Twitter list, thinking this would be interesting. But now I've stopped keeping track because it happens so often. Indrani, we did see some tactical cooperation in terms of striking deals to get something done between India and China. For example, at the Financial Action Task Force, this body that is for kind of countering terrorism, financing, and money laundering. Uh, what has India's approach been to that kind of tactical cooperation? How does it work those issues in these forums?
Well, if you remember, the tactical cooperation that we did have with China in the FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force, uh, pertained to Pakistan remaining in the grey list. But the tactical deal, and I think, frankly, multilateral diplomats, in my view, are literally masters of the deal, because, they master tactical deals. And China got Indians' endorsement for being the next president of the FATF. So it worked both ways. China needed India's endorsement because India's endorsement came then the American endorsement came. So China got a clean path to presidency the following year, and we got Pakistan to stay on the grey list. There was really no way Pakistan would have been out of the grey list, and nobody was going to put Pakistan in the blacklist. So, but yes, those deals have been there. But on the climate change, and Akbar is right. I think we used to do these because China often we used to have this fantasy about us, India and China being developing countries. I think somewhere close to a decade ago, we got wise to this. And I remember the former National Security Advisor used to say that we are not the same. China's pollution levels and ours just cannot be compared. So we cannot have the West tarring us with the same brush. We should actually be in a different place, because we used to have this romantic idea that we were like the Chinese. We're not. I think that moved from the time of the Paris Accord, I think, where we were in a different scale.
And I think another area you've seen this shift or learning or understanding and acknowledgement that India is not China was cyber governance. I remember there used to be this debate where India's initial view had been in these discussions that, like Russia and China, was going to take a kind of a multilateral approach, that it's basically a state-driven system. And over time, actually moved towards the position that Brazil essentially, I think, has, which is, and the West, yes, but it was really, I think, the Brazilian position that India was closer to, which is a multi-stakeholder approach that actually beyond the governments, private sector, and civil society also matters very much. This recognition that India is different from China. Akbar, I do want to move from kind of the multilateral system to some of these kind of new initiatives, new organizations, new kind of coalitions that have been forming. One of the things we saw, and we've seen different countries take the lead on this. We've seen China take the lead in something, for example, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now, as you mentioned, you talked about One Belt, One Road. That is something India has not joined, has boycotted, in fact, been very vocal about it. But it did join something like the AIIB. What explained that difference in terms of participating in one Chinese initiative, but not the
Right. So I think they are two different animals if you look at it through the multilateral lens. So the Asian Infrastructure Bank is a multilaterally negotiated treaty bank outcome. So there were discussions. India was participant in the discussions, and the outcome was a treaty which everybody agreed to. Also, let's not forget, while China was the initiator of that, the bank is in China, and China is the largest contributor. it's the only international bank where India is the second largest contributor.
Yes.
So you can clearly see that there is an advantage for us because we want finance from multilateral development institutions of every sort. The World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the New Development Bank of the BRICS, and of course the AIIB. So I think that's the fundamental difference. And look at what is BRI or One Belt, One Road. BRI is a hub and spoke arrangement. So all the spokes lead to the hub. There is no multilateralism unless this is a new format of multilateralism because China decides what it will provide assistance for. There is no treaty there. If there is a dispute, you go to Shanghai courts and find solutions to it. China will decide what every year is the budget allocation, etc., etc. So they are fundamentally different. The AIIB is still, yes, it's a non-Western, although several Western countries have also joined it since. But the Belt and Road is clearly a different kettle of fish, which is China's new model of multilateralism, if I may call it so, and so fundamentally different from the AIB, which is follows a traditional path of multilateralism, but initiative taken by China, like in the New Development Bank of the BRICS, where again we have a good say. All of us as founder members get the same amount of shares, and then China put in extra money and it gets the extra share. So I think we need to distinguish between those two elements. It doesn't have a debt trap concern there because uh, the bank follows rules. Basically, it's built on the model of the World
The
Bank
World Bank.
with an additional funding arrangement.
Indrani, long before AIIB or even BRI, you had India join. We didn't used to call them, I think, plurilaterals or minilaterals as they're being called today, but did join groupings. India did join groupings like the Russia, India, China trilateral, what used to be BRIC and is now BRICS, and now BRICS Plus with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then when South Africa joined. When India joined those, what was the motivation for India to do so?
Well, until the 90s, I would say, India's approach was to stay away from these groups. We missed out a lot. We stayed away. Say, for example, APEC. We were invited. We stayed away, and then the door closed. That was a learning within the Indian system, and after that, we've joined anything that came our way, everything. We lobbied for almost 2 decades to join SCO. Uh,
The
it was
Shanghai
called the Shanghai
Cooperation.
Five. If you remember, the original thing was that RIC was was a Russian sort of creation, and somewhere after the BRICS report came out, they decided to bring Brazil in, became BRIC, killed RIC, and then the Chinese brought in the South Africa. It became but what we have today is a strange concoction, in my view, because we have the original 4, 5 of the BRICS, but we have this other new lot. And I don't know if you saw, but Argentina said no to BRICS today. Uh, where the idea clearly is, it's inspired by China. China really wants to grow this as an anti-West alliance, an anti-West grouping. Very hard if you look at the new members. I mean, yes, Iran will always be anti-West, but UAE, Saudi Arabia, I don't think so. India. So I think what the BRICS Plus looks like today is a bit of a contested space. But yes, I mean, to go back to your point, we now, anybody calls us, we've now got quad pluses. Have you noticed? There are 2 quad pluses that at least have met once during the pandemic. Whether they meet again or not, we don't know. We reactivated the Japan, India, US trilateral, which had a meeting in Rio, I think, and followed soon after by an RIC meeting. We even resurrected the RIC out of nowhere because the RIC was subsumed into BRICS. Yet we have resurrected them. And during the G20, I noticed that IBSA suddenly found the India, Brazil, South Africa grouping, which actually was which could have actually been the best one out of the lot, but IBSA suddenly found expression because IBSA signed an agreement with the US. So during BRICS, it was an agreement that completely passed everybody by. Nobody noticed it. But I think these plurilateral groupings are becoming interesting contested spaces.
You mentioned contested spaces. Just to follow up, Indrani, you talked about kind of the anti-West nature of some of what these attempts are. I do think on IBSA, I will say one point, which is I noticed it partly because I was thinking as BRICS expansion was going on, these three democracies amongst BRICS are the ones who have the most to lose in terms of diluted influence with an expanded BRICS to some extent. And so it would be natural for them to start doing more together. And then I think there was a meeting on the sidelines of the UN Security Council. But in terms of the UN General Assembly this last year, in terms of contested spaces, as Akbar was saying, as China-India relations deteriorated, you saw an impact at the UN. Have you also seen this in these plurilaterals like BRICS, like RIC, which I believe has not met since 2020 at the leader level? Has there been kind of a spillover effect of China-India relations in these organizations or in India's attitude to these BRICS and Russia, India, China, or even Shanghai Cooperation Organization?
I think so. I think so. Akbar spoke about China putting its sort of constructs, whether it is Xi Jinping thought and if you look at, say, SCO, even BRICS, the new words are the global GSI, the Global Security Initiative, the GCI, the Global Civilization Initiative, and I forget the next one. But China tries to put all of these into the multilateral documents now, and it remains for India to push back. So therefore, China also pushed back against using Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam in the G20 documents, if you remember. But certainly, this is one of the tasks of our diplomats today, is to push back against the China narrative or mainstreaming the China narrative into a multilateral document. So yeah, it is. I think it is there.
For our listeners who are unaware, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is the kind of diplomatic mantra that the Modi government has been using, which is the world is one family,
One family.
a Sanskrit term. Akbar, we've already heard them mentioned in different ways, the US, Russia, even kind of European partners. As kind of what role have these other major or even middle powers been as India and China have interacted, competed, cooperated in multilateral organizations? How has India seen their role, and has it changed over time?
So actually, I think this question ties up into your earlier question of the role of these plurilateral or minilateral systems that we have seen. Now, many of these, for example, the RIC or IC or the SCO, these were all at a time when India was trying to start looking for partners everywhere. There were not many options of the Quad variety then. So it looked at Afghanistan, where should it play a role in Afghanistan? It thought that the SEO will be there. it wanted to be among the big boys. So it said, which other big boys will have us meet at foreign ministers level every time? Russia, India, and China. So these predate the new surge of engagement with the West, which is perhaps a phenomenon of the last, say, after the nuclear deal, which is 2007, 8, etc., and all, when ties started becoming. So the challenge is that we haven't been able to let go of institutions which are informal. So the RIC is an informal institution. It's not, doesn't have a secretariat, doesn't have a treaty, doesn't have anything. It's just a arrangement. Similarly, you look at the BRICS. Again, the challenge that we are now facing is, unlike China and Russia, which are consistently engaged on the multilateral landscape in every issue. We are not there yet. So they can trade off on many things. For example, on the Security Council, they trade off on every day they meet, they trade off. Now, when you go to the RIC or to the BRIC, you have on the one side two partners who who have a history of engagement among themselves, and they give something up and take something from there. So you have very little to offer in that scenario. So here's your challenge, that you have limited trading options, and therefore you are having this challenge of whether you should accept the global development initiative, the global security initiative, or the global civilizational initiative, which China will start populating very soon in the SCO. Now, the way India operates is, it looks at SCO in a very different manner than it looks at a multilateral organization. It looks at SCO as a regional body where it can facilitate engagement with Afghanistan. So we have a totally different set of actors handling that. And so here's your challenge, that whereas they see the linkages very clearly, we don't see those linkages. So in the SCO, you will suddenly find on data privacy issues which you are not now comfortable with, that data sovereignty should be only in the countries concerned. But in the SCO, look at the others. They don't have a challenge with the Chinese view on data privacy. They will all accept, the Russians will accept, so you are left alone. So inevitably, these things are going to get harder and harder for you as you go. Now, if you look back also and look what was the Russian interest, our interest in Russia with the UN, it was that it would help us should this issue come up in the Security Council. That's the original basis on which our ties strengthened in multilateral organizations. Today, if you look at it, who will bring this issue to the UN? There's only one permanent member who can bring it, that's China, which also is a party to that dispute because it has a problem on other side of the thing. And given Russia and China's engagement on in multiple engagements there is no scope that the Russians will be able to block it. So, of necessity, you are dependent on the three others who are permanent members. The others are, of course, non-permanent members. So the basis of our multilateral ties, which existed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, has now changed, both in terms of our domestic developments where our economic models are diverging, but also internationally, because if we see as threats, we see a different threat than we had seen before. And Pakistan, hopefully, has been left behind. It's not a major multilateral threat for us. It's only China which can prop up Pakistan, etc. So coming back, you will see greater engagement with other middle powers. That is Italy or Germany or UK. I'm sorry to call UK middle power, but that's what it is now. Irrespective of where it is positioned, it has a disproportionate influence in the multilateral system. That's another thing. But basically, these will be your allies because your challenges are not going to come from them. And The last point is your challenges perhaps can come on a human rights front. But China is so much ahead of us in facing this problem. It will do the dirty work if it has to tackle on human rights, about generic human rights, because we become too defensive on human rights. We need to be a little bit more assertive, because ultimately in multilateral situations what is important is the legal framework. Nobody gets into the nitty gritty of situations, and the legal framework that we possess is second to none. Sure, there will be some at a certain stage you may not be happy with how it is being implemented, etc. But compared to those who have no legal framework, who have egregious approaches to these, I think we need to be a little bit more forthcoming, because that's our only challenge. Our biggest challenge in multilateral diplomacy is not political, it's going to be largely social, because that's where the fault lines in our society too are. And so, if we have to look down the path in the future, we need to look and find friends who can understand better our social challenges, rather than try to have a dualistic approach to them. So that's my bigger thing, and it is happening too, because our ties with France, Germany, Italy have way expanded in the multilateral system, as they have expanded, to be fair, bilaterally too. It's not the same engagement that we have with them. And so we've tilted in some format to middle powers who understand us slightly better now. Also, they have economic interests to be a little bit more understanding of us than they were before, where those were very limited.
Indrani, Akbar mentioned a few areas where India is going to see challenges in the future. What do you think, especially when it comes to India, China, or China in the multilateral domain? Are there other challenges or opportunities for cooperation that you see on the road ahead?
Well, I think there will be more challenges, no question. For no other reason that that I think China has taken a decision that it will grant India no quarter uh, in the multilateral space, that it will exercise power in the multilateral space if even if that is detrimental to India. I think our bilateral relations have gone down that path. Um, you need a countervailing force in the international system. Um, to some extent, we have the US. To some extent, to a lesser extent, we have France. We had Russia. I'd say Russia is struggling itself right now. So in that sense, my view is yes, I agree with Akbar that we should be a lot more assertive. Uh, but we are playing with a weaker hand. We don't we don't. But I have to say that we do play a pretty good game. The other part is, there are multilateral organizations which we should promote, and at the top of the list is the Commonwealth. It is a group of 54, 55 countries with a shared history, and China is not part of the Commonwealth. It's a good playing ground for India. We need to be a lot more assertive. We need to be a lot more involved in Commonwealth. I mean, we used to look down on the Commonwealth and didn't really give it that kind of importance. But the Commonwealth is something that we should. This whole global South business. I mean, frankly, I don't think that there is no point in resurrecting old groupings like G77, which has now become G134, I think, or and NAM, etc. I don't think they have they have any real relevance. The global South, it is actually India's to define. It is India's to define. It is India's to shape in a 21st century mold. I think we did a decent job with the voice of the global South for the G20, bringing in the African Union. The key is to be able to show that we can get the G20 to work even with 54 countries having just joined in to this group of 20. So there are still areas where India can be much more creative, much more assertive with its multilateral diplomacy. I think the question is largely of capacity and of political will. I think we do have political will because we've seen, we've reaped the benefits of successful multilateral diplomacy. I mean, Akbar has that absolutely super book out on how India negotiates in it. But I think we need to do a little more. We do have, the Indian system has the bilateralists and the multilateralists. I think we need to add to our multilateral, arsenal.
So I think the global South is also interesting because I think it is part of that engagement with at least developing countries writ large, not necessarily the global South as a whole. But it's going to be both an arena of China-India competition, but I also think it helps
Absolutely.
create space for India that needs, as you said, other partners, even beyond the kind of major and middle powers. It's a different matter that, most of the global South, when there's an India-China problem, much like the non-aligned world, will not say very much in India as a thing, but at least for specific things, including memberships of organization and speaking up as developing countries, that they'll have a role. Akbar, we usually end our discussions with a question, a kind of a lightning round question, and it usually involves talking about a myth. So if I had to ask you, what is the greatest myth or misunderstanding that you hear about India-China dynamics in the multilateral domain or in these minilateral groupings? What would your myth on that front be?
So actually, it goes back to the time when I first confronted Chinese diplomats, going back to the 1990s. I grew up with the belief that China thinks long term. It thinks in generations, decades, I don't know, centuries also. It plays this long game. And so I used to think that every word they say is being measured, it's been calculated, etc. And then very soon I realized that they are human too. They are not the superhumans that we've made them out to be. They make mistakes. And it's just that we have to be nimble enough to use the opportunities that come our thing. And that perhaps is where they have a advantage over us, because they send back people to the same countries and specialize. Because as we started by saying that we have a weaker hand multilaterally because we don't spend that much money, we don't provide that much of resources. So if that is so, we have to be nimble in terms of the process. And that's where being nimble on the process means investing more in the human resources, etc. So I quickly learned that the BRI is not a 1,100-year thing, because it started as OBOR, One Belt, One Road. After some time, they changed it to BRI. Now they've added a development initiative to it, Global Development Initiative. So it's not a reflection of a country which has thought this through for decades or centuries. They are human like us, and we started, I didn't at that state contest that China is being assertive in terms of global institutions. But that was a few years ago. Today, if you go back and look at the list of international organizations headed by Chinese, there's only one. Because the world took some time to understand the ugly American. It's taken a faster time to understand that there is another ugly personnel coming up. So the pressure that you put on small countries tends to fly in your face, where they can do things when they don't know who's going to be held accountable. When you are held accountable, they will do other things. But when they know that nobody knows in the secrecy of a ballot, etc., people react differently. And so I think that this myth that the Chinese look for a 100-year long game is not, it's only a myth, because later I found that actually apparently this starts off with a conversation between Chow En-lai and Dr. Kissinger in 1972, when Dr. Kissinger asks Chow En-lai that, what do you think of the French Revolution? And so Chow En-lai says, it's too early to say how it is. And all the West took it up, saying that after 200 years also the Chinese are saying it's too early. But actually later on the interpreter said, well, he made a mistake. It was the students' revolt of 1968 that Chow En-lai was thinking of. So myths are made like these. They're all human. And we need to understand that with human ingenuity, we can address them too.
Indrani, what is your greatest myth on this front?
The China hides behind a group, or I mean, it's a fungible group of countries when it needs to oppose anything in a multilateral situation. So when we see that a multilateral initiative has 7 countries or 10 countries opposing it, you peel away the layers, you'll find that it's actually the Chinese at the end of it. And so a lot of global opposition is also inspired opposition.
With that, thank you both for joining us for this episode looking at India-China dynamics in the multilateral and minilateral domains. Thank you very much, Akbar.
Thank you.
And thank you to you as well, Indrani.
Thank you.